Shalom, dear friends. I greet all of you. Welcome. Our course After the Flame begins and opens this week. Today we're talking about the topic. We're starting off this week. This week we're continuing, in a way, what we discussed last week. We're still talking about the first Christians, sort of the second generation after the Christians, about the Acts of the Apostles. We talked about the Ebionites. We talked about the Nazarenes. We discussed the essence of the problems, the root of things, about who believed what and how. Today, we continue this week under the heading Christianity and Rome. Today's lesson is called The First Roman View of Christians. This week we will talk about a very interesting topic. Why did Christians reject paganism, but not the Torah? Because in order to reject paganism, you have to accept the Torah. Because it is the Torah that guides you toward the concept of monotheism, that is, the idea of one God, it leads you into this formula of monotheism. Why did Christians not actually reject the Torah, but why did they reject paganism? And we will also finish this week with a very important topic, the cult of saints and the journey from remembrance to deification. This is a crucial point because right after the sufferers and martyrs, people soon moved on to the deification and cult of saints. All these issues arise during the transitional period between the 1st and 2nd centuries. So, today our lesson is about how Rome viewed Christians. So, we are opening a new chapter in our study. We have already talked about the clash with Greek philosophy. We have already discussed even those particular emphases. Today is already our 12th lesson, and I recommend that if you haven't listened from the beginning, you should definitely start at the beginning of this course. So, today we are talking about the collision of two worlds. On one side, there is the mighty Roman Empire, a civilization with a 1,000-year history, its own gods, laws, ideas about order, and traditions. And on the other side, there is a completely new Jewish movement, which the Romans generally saw as just a part of Judaism or something close to it. At first, they didn't even notice it. Today, we will try to immerse ourselves in the mindset of a Roman citizen, senator, or official. We'll try to understand whom they saw, what alarmed them, what aroused their suspicions, and even mortal fear. So this isn't just some kind of historical excursion that I'm taking with you. By understanding this initial perspective, we will grasp the origins of centuries-long persecutions, the reason why the blood of martyrs flowed like a river in those times. These martyrs were not only Christians, they were also Jews. But after this week, we will continue studying Jewish history. From time to time, I will deliberately pause to shift to Christian history. And in this way, we will develop an understanding of two lines moving together. Thus, we will study these two histories up until the year 325, the founding of Nicaea. This will be a big course, actually, but it's only the beginning. The main things will come later. Today, we will understand the rumors, the speculations, the ideological disagreements that created the image of the enemy. The state loves to create the image of an enemy. That's what the state has been doing throughout history. The state creates images of enemies. And when the state manages to create the image of an enemy, it gives a purpose and direction for human hatred. That image was the Christians. Why? And what did they do to deserve this? Let's try to understand. So, it's the middle of the first century. If you had asked an educated Roman about Christians, most likely he would have just shrugged. Why would he shrug? Because, in reality, Rome had subjugated such a huge number of peoples, so many, in fact, that the typical, ordinary Roman, the average Roman, didn't even know how many gods, beliefs, sects, and all sorts of movements existed within the Roman Empire itself. Everyone knew the central gods around whom Rome was built. The central gods, yes. But because there were so many people in the Roman Empire, in this huge melting pot of nations where the empire's beliefs existed, Christians were practically invisible. At first, they were even confused with the Jews. But we know that Judaism was considered by Rome to be an ancient religion, though a strange one. Strange, but permitted. It was called religio licita, a permitted religion. Why? Because Jews had the right. Jews had the right not to honor the Roman gods due to the antiquity of their faith. And the Romans, in a way, treated the Jewish faith with respect. There was a large Jewish community in Rome itself. Many Jews were quite wealthy and well established and belonged to various social classes. And the Romans, generally speaking, didn't treat the Jews badly at all, although they did consider them very strange and foolish. Jews who were supposed to circumcise themselves. For the Romans, this was incomprehensible. Why should you restrict yourself in food, for example? But very soon the Romans began to notice that a new group that had formed was behaving differently. This group actively started accepting non-Jews and people from all social classes into their ranks, and most importantly, demanded that they completely break with their usual way of life. Jews did not accept Romans. They did not accept others. They lived in their own neighborhoods, their own cities. But Christians accepted everyone. The Roman historian Tacitus, one of the first to describe Christians, gave them a damning characterization. The so-called destructive superstition, which is called exhibitus superstitio. Don't hold me to the correct pronunciation. I might be mistaken. But just think about these few words. For a Roman, superstitio is not just faith, it's a perverted, fanatical religiosity that destroys the foundations of society. It's a private, closed-off belief and, as a rule, hostile to the state. So, everything that cannot be controlled, explained, or analyzed is considered hostile to the state. That is superstitio, a perverted, fanatical religiosity. Why? Because Christians refused to do what was the foundation of Roman social and political life. And what did they refuse to do? For example, they did not honor the gods. They did not honor the gods of Rome. And let me tell you, disrespecting the gods of Rome was a crime. From Rome's point of view, the well-being of the empire directly depended on the proper veneration of its patron gods. If you didn't honor the Roman gods, you were wishing for the empire to fall apart, wishing evil upon the empire. The Christians' refusal to offer sacrifices to them was seen as nothing less than an act that would bring the wrath of the gods upon the whole city and the entire empire. So now, if you're some group and you don't want to make sacrifices to our gods, does that mean you want us dead? Well then, it's on you. It's your fault. The punishments of the gods will fall upon us. What do you think they called them? You'd never guess. They called them atheists. At that time, an atheist was someone who didn't acknowledge the existence of the gods and was considered a criminal. In that polytheistic world, an atheist wasn't just a person of science. How will we understand this in the future? In that world, an atheist was someone who didn't recognize the Roman gods and challenged Rome. These were poor people. They were considered uneducated. Well, what can you expect from them? Mostly, they were slaves. Mostly, they were from the lowest social classes. But nevertheless, more and more people started to be drawn to them, both Jews and non-Jews. And this already started to smell like some kind of conspiracy. An even scarier thing than not honoring the gods was that they didn't honor the genius of the emperor. The emperor wasn't just a president or the head of government or an official like today. The emperor was a god. There were sacrifices made to the emperor. And sacrifices to the emperor were a sign of loyalty. Just like for us today, for example, swearing allegiance to the flag. Swearing allegiance to the flag or singing the anthem is, for us today, a normal reaction to identifying with our country. Sacrificing to the emperor was exactly the same thing. A Christian's refusal was a direct political challenge. This made them, in the eyes of the authorities, unreliable elements and potential traitors. Maybe they're spies? They're definitely a fifth column and definitely foreign agents. This secrecy and otherness gave rise to monstrous rumors among the people, which were eagerly picked up by all sorts of uneducated as well as educated authors. Christians began to be accused of three terrible things. Even these things alone were enough for persecution. First, atheism. As we've already mentioned, they began to be accused of atheism, which, at that time, was already considered a pretty serious crime. They began to be accused of debauchery, their secret gatherings, where they called each other brothers and sisters, and had the kiss of peace, that is, holy kisses. Now, the fevered imagination of the pagans turned this into orgies and incest. What are they doing in there? They hug and kiss each other. You don't need a newspaper for that. Rumors spread faster than we think. Then they were also accused of cannibalism. Notice that in all the accusations against the early Christians, Jews would also be accused of the same things. Not in Rome. The following centuries in Europe, it was the same story. They would say that Jews in synagogues engage in orgies and also in cannibalism, that is, they drink blood, our children's blood. Cannibalism is the most horrifying accusation. Why cannibalism? Because there were phrases like eat my body, take my body, and drink my blood. All these words reached outsiders in a horribly distorted form. The Romans seriously believed that Christians, at their secret nighttime services, killed infants and drank their blood. In the future, these very same accusations would become the basis for the Inquisition's persecution of Jews. But right now, we're only talking about Christians. My friends, these were not the same Christians as those we have today. Today's Christians and those Christians are completely different people. They're different not just because of the centuries and millennia that separate them, they're different in every way. Tacitus even writes that they were hated for their abominations. And Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia, several decades later would write to Emperor Trajan that he tried to find out, under torture, from two Christian maidservants what they did at their gatherings. And he found out that, basically, there was nothing special. They sang hymns to Christ and swore not to commit crimes. Basically, they didn't do anything terrible. But even after that, he considered their stubbornness and unyielding persistence worthy of punishment. That's what this first impression really was like. It was a mix of contempt for a new superstition, fear of a secret society, and revulsion fueled by terrifying rumors. Christians were the perfect outsiders to blame for any misfortune. They were guilty of everything. Espionage, of course. Undermining the foundations of the state? Why not? After all, they don't worship our gods. In theory, accusations and everyday hatred are one thing. We Jews know about that, too. But in the year 64 AD, this image of the enemy was used at the state level. This event forever changed the relationship between Christianity and Rome. We're talking about the Great Fire of Rome and the role of Emperor Nero. In July of 64, fire destroyed much of the Eternal City. My friends, there are excellent works that actually describe all these events. Rumors quickly spread that Nero himself was the arsonist, wanting to clear space for his grand golden palace that he planned to build. The emperor's own position became very precarious. He urgently needed a scapegoat. And a scapegoat was found. Now, today I'm talking about the first look. On Wednesday, I'll tell you who Nero really was, and many things will become clear to you. Let's turn again to Tacitus, who was a contemporary of these events. He didn't like either Nero or the Christians, which makes his testimony especially valuable. He writes the following: So Nero, to counter the rumors, sought out the guilty and subjected to exquisite punishments those who, by their abominations, had drawn upon themselves the hatred of all, and whom the crowd called Christians. The word Christian comes from the root from the word Christ, that is, Messianics, in Hebrew Mashiachim. Messianics, or Mashiachists, was the term used for absolute fanatics, religious fanatics who were obsessed with the end of the world, with the Messiah, and everything that is obsessed with the Messiah is, by definition, obsessed with the apocalypse. This was the first persecution of Christians in history that was officially initiated by an emperor. Nero didn't just accuse them, he turned their execution into a monstrous spectacle. That was something he was a professional at. It was a way to both entertain the crowd and channel their anger in the desired direction. Anger always needs to be channeled in the right direction. Tacitus describes 3 types of executions that took place in Nero's gardens. Crucifixion was the traditional shameful execution for slaves and rebels. It was by this very execution that Yeshua was crucified. As a rebel and someone who challenged the emperor, Caesar. Being thrown to wild beasts. People were sewn into animal skins and thrown into the arena to hungry dogs. We will discuss the details of all these events with you on Wednesday in the continuation of our course. Today, I'm just giving you, so to speak, the beginning of this. Later, they also made living torches. Living torches looked something like this. Well, not exactly like that. Living torches were a special invention of Nero. Christians were smeared with a flammable mixture, tied to poles, and set on fire at nightfall so they would light up the emperor's gardens. Just imagine that horror. These weren't just abstract numbers. These were real people from the Roman community itself. Men, women, children. Imagine the smell of burning human flesh hanging over the whole city. According to some tradition, both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul were there, executed in Rome around the same time. But again, from a historical and scientific perspective, there is no clear consensus that Peter and Paul were actually executed in Rome. As surprising as it may seem, that's the case. Everything we know about the executions of the apostles comes from Christian sources. But when scholars started looking into the evidence for these things, there turned out to be different opinions about it. Paradoxically, even for the Romans, who were used to cruelty, this made a horrifying impression. Tacitus ends his account by saying that although these people were guilty of their superstition, their brutal execution aroused compassion. People realized that they were being killed not for the public good, as if you could kill someone for the public good, but to satisfy the bloodlust of a single man whose name was Nero. It was at this very moment that Christian martyrdom was born. The Greek word martyros means witness. That is, a martyr is someone who, by their death, bears witness to their faith. But martyrdom is, in fact, a Jewish concept. Jews have always been martyrs for their faith. Later, Christians joined in, and then Christians began to use this concept against the Jews. All of this, my friends, we will read together. For the church, in reality, this became not a defeat, but a victory. The steadfastness of these first martyrs in the face of unimaginable suffering became the most powerful argument in favor of their faith. Again, these were truly devout Christians who were ready to die for their faith, ready to suffer immensely, ready, even to utterly perish. Nero wanted to destroy them, but instead, by what he did to them, he made them the most revered heroes and laid the foundation of their identity. Basically, it's the same thing that Christian civilization would later do to the Jews. All the persecutions, in fact, did not destroy but only strengthened them. But that's not the point. Now, why were they so inconvenient? And what is the root of this conflict? Okay, we understand Nero was an eccentric tyrant. But why did the persecutions continue after him? Why did even good emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius see Christians as a threat? That's a very interesting question. To understand this, we need to dig deeper and look at the very essence of early Christianity, which was absolutely incompatible with the Roman world order. In order to understand why Christians were persecuted alongside Jews, we need to understand why the Jews rebelled against Rome. After all, at these moments, uprisings against Rome were happening in the Jewish world. And why Christians were persecuted in exactly the same way. So we come together to this question, which we will discuss. Why did Christians reject paganism but not reject the Torah as God's law? And why do today's Christians reject the Torah and embrace paganism? You see how everything is the opposite. In fact, everything is happening in a completely reversed way. On the one hand, their rejection of paganism was absolute. But why was their rejection so absolute? On what basis? On the basis that paganism is forbidden by the Torah. After all, there was no New Testament at that time. No scrolls, no letters, no canon, nothing. Some letters existed somewhere, but Christians, what did they know? What scriptures did they have in their hands? In the Didache. But the Didache says the same thing because the Didache is the moral code of the community itself. Contains the very same things. Why did Christians reject paganism? Because the Torah rejects paganism. And the rejection of paganism was absolute. And why did Christians in later centuries not reject paganism, but on the contrary, mix everything with paganism, like the pagan holidays that were blended with Christian ones? Because the Torah, which the first Christians held on to, was rejected. For a Roman, religion was a part of public life. You offer a sacrifice to Jupiter for the prosperity of Rome. To Vesta, to the goddess Vesta for the well-being of the home. And that's where the word Vesti comes from, good news, bad news. To the local spirits for a good harvest. This was normal and proper. But Christians claimed that all these gods were just idols, pieces of wood, stone, or even demons. Where did they get this knowledge? How do they understand this? Where did they get the idea that this is wrong? After all, just yesterday they were still doing it. Now suddenly they realize that this is forbidden. Where did they get the knowledge of what is allowed and what is not allowed? The New Testament canon did not exist. This is beginning transition from 1st to 2nd century. Canon would be established centuries later. Centuries. and the first printed Bible would only appear in the 15th century. So what were these Christians basing themselves on? In the eyes of their neighbors, they were antisocial elements who were destroying age-old traditions. But that's exactly how the Jews lived. Notice that all these words fit the Jews very well too. They weren't just Jews, they were also people. But here's what was important. They weren't Jews by blood, they were Jews in essence. They revered the Torah, the prophets, and the scriptures. They considered the God of Israel to be their God. And they believed that the crucified Jew, Yeshua, whom they called the Son of God, was a Jew among Jews, a pure monotheist, for whom any thoughts about idols and gods were an abomination. For the Romans, this was absurd. For the Romans, it was completely absurd to worship a man executed on a Roman cross in some Judea as a criminal. How could you worship and revere as the Son of God, as the Son of the gods, some crucified Jew whom the Romans themselves had crucified? Especially since he was a Jew. Are you serious? This is absolutely unacceptable. For the Greeks and Romans, this was absurd. How can you worship an executed criminal? As a result, they found themselves in this bad situation. Not just bad, but dangerous. For the Romans, they were not just followers of a foreign god, like the Jews, for example, who openly said they followed Yahweh. They weren't just that, they were considered atheists who were actively trying to win over Roman citizens to their side. And they also turned other Romans away from worshiping the emperor's gods. In other words, they were a real ideological threat. The Jewish people also distanced themselves from them, primarily because they did not want these individuals to be associated with them and consequently draw unwanted attention and potential conflict onto themselves. The Jews also existed and tried to survive in this boiling cauldron called Rome. So the first Christians couldn't hide behind any of the existing categories. They couldn't hide behind the synagogue. The synagogue had distanced itself from them, already at that time drawing clear boundaries of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And they couldn't be accepted by their fellow Romans. They couldn't say, "We are loyal citizens. We honor the gods. We are law-abiding." At that time, being law-abiding meant honoring the gods. Even though I kept saying one should be law-abiding, when it comes to religion, we should obey only the word of God. In terms of social life, one should obey the law. In matters of faith, one should be devoted only to the Creator. When these boundaries become blurred, the very essence of a believer is lost. That's why they couldn't say, "We are loyal citizens. We honor your gods." Their faith demanded exclusivity, which was incompatible with Roman syncretism. The Jewish community also distanced itself from them. Their unwavering stubbornness and uncompromising attitude, which the Roman writer Pliny the Elder aptly called unyielding persistence, was indeed the primary and most significant reason why Rome's initial view of them was so profoundly hostile. Rome could understand and accept a lot. There were all sorts of beliefs in Rome. Rome could understand and accept a lot, but it could not accept those who claimed there was only one truth, and that it had nothing to do with the greatness of Rome and its gods. That just couldn't be. So, my friends, today we've reconstructed a bit of that very first lesson from this week, which gives us a look at the Roman Empire's perspective on Christians. Now, there won't be a broadcast tomorrow. We'll continue only on Wednesday. On Wednesday, we'll have a Hebrew lesson, as well as a continuation of our course, where I'll tell you more in depth about Rome and Nero. But even today, in this first look, we've already seen all the ignorant prejudices, destructive superstitions, accusations of atheism, and the making of Christians into enemies of humanity. The first Christians were enemies of humanity, but later Christians made Jews into enemies of humanity. And we'll be studying that path as well. The conflict was inevitable. These were very stubborn people because they were real people. It was embedded in the DNA of early Christianity because early Christianity was founded by Jews. The foundation was a refusal to make any compromise with the pagan world and its claims. They believed there was only one path to the Creator. And they believed there was only one Creator. This is very important, my friends. This is the foundation of the first Christians. This initial perspective we're talking about today defined the relationship between the Church and the Empire for the next 250 years. The next 250 years would be a time of underground existence, with periodic harsh persecutions, but steady growth. Growth precisely because of their steadfastness and the very essence of their morality. This was the Christianity of the very first believers, before it became orthodoxy. But this week, we'll also look at how the memory of the martyrs evolved into a cult of personality, or a cult of saints. That's also important to understand. I see your comments, my friends. Wonderful. There's a good book. Anton writes about these times. Sinkowitz, Quo Vadis. There's a very interesting topic there about Nero and the Christians. Thank you. I think there was even a film made called Quo Vadis. My friends, we'll see each other tomorrow, as I said. Now I'll tell you once again what's going to happen, so you remember it. So, tomorrow there won't be a broadcast. We'll continue only on Wednesday. On Wednesday, we'll do a deeper lesson about Nero and the persecutions. Then we'll talk about why Christians rejected paganism but not the Torah. We'll take this analysis even deeper. And also, if we get to the cult of saints and their deification, that would be great. Now, next week, If the Lord graciously allows and everything proceeds smoothly and goes well, we'll move on. We'll already begin to start on the significant Jewish line. And we'll already be diligently preparing for the upcoming year 132, specifically for the significant times of the great revolt of Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. We'll be talking, so before we delve into the significant historical events surrounding Bar Kokhba, we will first thoroughly discuss the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan, a pivotal figure, and meticulously examine his specific and impactful policies towards the Jewish people during his extensive rule. The most interesting part will be when we talk about the year 115. This is the revolt in the diaspora when uprisings broke out in Egypt, Cyprus, and Cyrenaica. It's called the Kitos War. It was this war that Rome fought, and it was during this time that the Jews of the diaspora rose up. This was still before Bar Kokhba. We will talk about how devastatingly the Jewish communities in the diaspora were suppressed by Rome, and how, against the backdrop of this uprising of the Jewish diaspora, why it began and how it ended, Rabbi Akiva and his Messiah Bar Kokhba began to rise. Because in the year 130, there was a complete ban on circumcision. And there was a law to build a pagan temple in Jerusalem. This was what triggered the uprising, as well as many other things that Rome did in order for this to happen. When we study these paths and at the same time also study the paths of the church, the Christian path, a lot of things will become clear and accessible. I'm sure, I hope that you will have the tools to understand your own path. My friends, I wish you all blessings. Thank you to everyone who joins our historical broadcasts and our regular ones. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, the bell, and the thank you button. Shalom to everyone. Have a great week.